Oh, there we go. It's working. Just a preview, which is not. Okay.
All right, so there we go. Okay.
All right. Hold on.
Yeah.
I don't think it's blocked.
Oh no, I think
Why it's here made for.
I'll be okay.
If you want, or you can just jump into the introduction. Up to you.
Okay, I'll do my one little commercial.
Okay.
So I'm going to do my one little commercial that I've done before, but I'm going to do it again. So this morning, we taught the professional practice 2 course. And so here were the students. There were the students in the classroom. There were the students who were remote at home in New Jersey. There were the students who were remote in Rome. And then there were the students who were remote in China. Okay? And they were all there taking the same class. And it was just amazing. It's absolutely amazing. It's 9 o'clock here in the morning. It's 3 o'clock in Rome. It's 9 o'clock in the evening in China. We had the faculty member from China on. We had Margaret Rubin on from New York. You know, we finally passed the pandemic where remote education was a burden, and now it's an opportunity. And, you know, just be aware of this and start to reach out and engage it. Also, you know, if you get the chance to travel, you gotta do it. You guys were in China 3 years ago, right? Was it worth it? Absolutely, it was. And we'd be happy to see your friends again. So these are kind of just the unique things about our school. So park that, and I'll probably say this all over again next week.
All right. Just to verify, can the folks on YouTube hear us? Assuming they can. All right. I want to introduce Galen, our lecturer for today. Galen Pardee is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia GSAP and is the Andrew Mellon Chair for Sustainable Design and Environmental Architecture at Sarah Lawrence College. He directs the Design and Research Studio Drawing Agency. He received his BA from Brandeis and an MArch from Columbia. In addition to Columbia University, Galen has taught at The Ohio State University, where he was a 2019-2021 Lefevre Emerging Practitioner Fellow. Drawing Agency focus on the material dimensions of the built environment, the legal structure, labor, and logistics that shape our buildings and cities. Designing with these embodied costs in mind, Drawing Agency delivers new interventions when required, collaborates with existing conditions, and questions the future of architectural practice through speculative projects and exhibitions. Recent and ongoing projects include Territories of Territory Extraction, an omnibus exploration of Singapore's entanglement with the geopolitics of its international sand trade, and the Great Lakes Architectural Expedition. The work has been published widely and exhibited in the United States and abroad, including the Chicago Architectural Biennial, the Venice Architectural Biennial, and supported by The Ohio State University. I like they always include the Ohio. Columbia University, and the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. Personally, I would describe Galen's work as a balancing act, threading the line between landscape, architecture, global politics, and economics, while committing itself to an aesthetic and design agenda. What I find to be the most compelling about Galen's work is through this balancing act and the multitude of scales he works at, he creates projects that are digestible. Even as it grapples with so many scales and complexity, Galen's work is easy to grasp and understand, which I find to be a great feat. Thank you, Galen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephanie, for that. That was a really nice introduction, and I like the. I appreciate the acknowledgement of understandability, digestibility. Can everybody in the back hear me? Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, because I think that's actually sort of a thing I want to talk about. So the title, this lecture has a title that doesn't really matter that much, but just to sort of like ground you guys in how I've been thinking about my practice, both as a as a practitioner, but also as a teacher. And this made-up term, post-concreteness, both relates to sort of an obsession with a material, i.e. concrete, but also, trying to like sort of grapple with this idea of like, what exactly am I trying to get at with my work? Where do I see things going with the sort of profession of architecture as like a super, super broad term? And so the main sort of through line of this is that, what I'm feeling is that many things that we as architects think of as kind of not architecture actually, in fact, have a much, much greater impact on the architecture that we can build or the way that we think. And within this mindset, I feel like there's some sort of real implications for breaking down barriers, i.e. like a sort of like conceptual concreteness about like the architect does this, the landscape architect does that, the client is this, et cetera, et cetera. But also in that sort of broader discussion about like where architecture fits in a process of building, I also like to think about the ways in which it has like a material implication too that makes our buildings and built works, I should say, like a lot more agile, a lot more forward thinking, and much less deterministic. So I'm going to go through 4 projects, hopefully leave enough time for questions. I'm going to try to keep this pretty snappy. But before I start, I just want to show maybe a couple projects that sort of started me on this trajectory of thinking. So the first, this is the Ant Farm Truck Stop Network, which is a project from 1971. And the main deliverable of this project is just a sort of like diner-style placemat, right, like a paper placemat. And what spoke to me about this piece is that it is implying an architecture or a connection or a framework where there isn't really one to begin with, right? Truck stops pop up around the interstates and freeways, but just as objects, they're sort of disconnected and kind of like singular. But if you started to think about, say, attaching a inflatable trailer to your van full of off-the-grid hippie buddies and driving around on the interstate highway system of America in the 70s, they might actually start to feel like nodes in a bigger system that you could sort of intervene in or think about at scale. From the other side, this is a 2 pages from a magazine, or a journal actually, sorry, published by the Detroit Geographic Expedition and Institute, which was a sort of pioneering community-led center in Detroit that was engaging with the sort of racial and environmental politics of that city during a time of both kind of post-white flight, immediately sort of after urban renewal sort of stopped in American cities. And to contrast that with Ant Farm, which is very much kind of like inside baseball, architecture and art for architects, the Detroit Geographic Expedition actually kept their sort of like structure very kind of broad-based. They would actually work with community members in Detroit and have them produce these maps, and all they would do is sort of train them with a sort of very basic set of geographic and map-making principles, and allow people who actually lived in these areas to make these drawings about their experience, where they saw problems, things that they were noticing. I mean, obviously, some of these issues were very serious. You can see the drawing over here on the left is about literally like cars being driven from people commuting from the suburbs to downtown, driving through primarily African American neighborhoods and like hitting children or adults too, one assumes. And then on the other hand, something as relatively prosaic as like the cleanliness of a street, right? And the idea being you don't need to have a fancy education or be trained as a kind of spatial thinker to think about problems of a city or your neighborhood and sort of identify these things in a constructive way. So those two, I show those projects just as a way of kind of grounding both how I approach, I would say, the kind of like drawing part of drawing agency, but also thinking about the kind of agency part of drawing agency. I just came up with that. And what I want to do now is kind of move through. So I'm going to show, as I said, 4 projects, 2 sort of like research speculative projects that are ongoing, and then 2 from my sort of like building practice that sort of try to triangulate between these issues. So this is Territories of Territory Extraction. This is an ongoing research project. I've been working on this since about 2018. And what I want to start with is actually nothing to do with, a lot to do with Singapore, but geographically this is very different. This is a small Indonesian island called Nepa Island. And what you can see in these 2 images is that there's actually been 3 different versions of this island. from 1990, it had this kind of like full extent that you can see on the left side image. But by 2003, it had been shrunk into this little sliver kind of sandbar thing. What had happened was not climate change. This is not rising tides. This is actually sand miners supplying Singapore with sand, coming and basically dredging the island away. This led to an international incident. Indonesia banned selling sand to Singapore. But because this island actually sits right on the sort of maritime boundary between Indonesia and Singapore, they had to reconstruct the island, otherwise it would not count as territory, and that maritime boundary would shift in Singapore's favor. So in a sort of ironic way, Indonesia had to engage in this sort of collection of material, bringing sand back to this island, presumably from someplace else in its territory, in order to make it what you see on the right, which is a slide from, which is an image from 2018. So to put this in context, again, this sort of near death and rebirth of Nepa Island takes place in the context of Singapore's desire for construction-grade sand. Singapore is using sand, which is a key component of both concrete, but also fill material if you wanted to, reclaim land from the ocean. And the overall goal is to expand its total area by 30% by 2030. So this is 1991. Nepa Island, you can see, describes this little kind of inversion in this boundary between Indonesia down here, Singapore up here. This is actually Malaysia. So Singapore is just a tiny little island kind of right in the middle of Southeast Asia. So that's 1991. This is today. As you can see, most of the growth is actually along Singapore's coastline. Just kind of flipping back and forth here. And what sort of is unique about this, a lot of cities and a lot of nations do this kind of infrastructure work, but Singapore, because it's this tiny island, has actually already exhausted all of its sort of naturally occurring reserves of construction-grade sand. This puts it in a very strange position globally that it has to actually import sand from other countries to use in its own growth. So territories of territory extraction is all about kind of like exploring this path of sand, a single material, and both its sort of literal role as building Singapore, but also the sort of politics of what that actually means on the ground and what that looks like, and how do you go about sort of capturing something that spans, as you'll see in the next few slides, a really geographically vast area, right? Like all the places that the Singaporeans buy sand from, and then gets condensed down into a sort of like otherwise fairly, I don't want to say generic looking, but Singapore as a city looks a lot like many other cities in Southeast Asia, and looks like a lot of many other cities in the Americas or in Europe. So how do we sort of like trace this material from point A to point B and use our toolkit as as people trained in architectural graphics and image making to sort of identify this thing? So I keep mentioning construction grade sand. For those of you who don't know, so you can't just make concrete out of anything. Sand that's formed by wind, so think like the deserts in Dubai or the Sahara, those are actually very spherical, and that means when you put them in a concrete mixture, they actually don't bind together very well. Think of it like kind of an oatmeal cookie sort of consistency. You want a lot of irregular shapes, you want a lot of like different sizes, because that's going to make a tighter bond. So sand that's been formed by water action, right? So riverbeds, dried up lakes, active lakes, the ocean, provide sand that is basically suitable for construction. This is a sort of early attempt to capture the scope of sand as a sort of commodity. It is probably the second most mined material on the whole planet, other than maybe water. And a UN report from 2012 estimated that if you took all the sand and gravel that was mined in that year and kind of shoved it all together, you would get a wall the circumference of the Earth, 27 meters wide and 27 meters tall. So again, just to kind of grapple with the scale of this thing as an object, I was trying to see what this would look like if it were to pass through Singapore's downtown. obviously that doesn't quite capture the sort of entanglement of sand, both as concrete, but also as this kind of fill material. These are buildings under construction. I should mention I was able to visit Singapore in the spring of 2019, thanks to the Graham Foundation for their support. And what I started to realize once I got beyond just sort of the global scale of it, when you actually do start zooming in to Singapore, sand is more than just a building material, it is the building material. So in addition to using it, as I mentioned, to expand its coastline, it's actually sort of restructured the way the construction industry functions in Singapore itself. Poured in place or precast concrete is actually very easy to work with if you think about it. You don't need to know how to weld. You don't need to know carpentry. You don't need to know any of that. You just need to know how to put the mixture in a form or attach things together that are already cast. And so to compound that, Singapore uses a largely migrant labor force, and worker visas can only go for 2 years maximum. So from a construction standpoint, anytime you spend training your workers on how to do what you want them to do is a waste of time. So concrete makes a lot of sense because you can train people very quickly and get them in the field for as much of that 2-year period as you can afford. That's also now reverberated back into the building code that Singapore uses to build its buildings. So, they have written their sort of standards in a lot of their public housing, which is a big player. We don't have time to go into this, but a big player in Singapore is their sort of state-owned public housing. It's actually basically assumed to be precast modular concrete construction now. Even if you wanted to change it, as an architect, you would be fighting an uphill battle to try and go against all of these various, standards, and the easy way to do it is concrete, basically. So as I said before, most nations can supply their sand from either a lake that they have within their borders, their own area. Singapore can't. It's just too small, too densely settled already. And so what this graph is showing is basically there have been sort of successive waves of trade relationships that Singapore has established with its neighbors in order just to get concrete. Singapore has been the largest importer per capita globally of sand for much of the past 30 years. That probably will not change anytime soon. But the one thing that keeps happening, and you can see it with these red lines, is that these nations that Singapore is trading with eventually get fed up with it and ban or outlaw selling sand to Singapore. And so what that leaves us with is this kind of incomplete sort of tapestry, right? We can tell because Singapore is growing that sand is moving, things are going into the ground, things are being built. But a lot of what I was trying to grapple with in this project was how do you sort of figure out where this stuff is coming from when it's so mundane that you couldn't even tell just by looking at it whether this came from a quarry next to you or one that was 100 miles away. So what I just want to run through real quick here is 3 ways that this project tries to use the urban fabric of Singapore itself as a way of registering these changes and attempting to sort of at least draw some kind of scalar conclusions about the impact of sand on the city. So starting first, the sand stockpiles. So just the same way that a bank stockpiles money in case their people need to withdraw it, Singapore stockpiles sand because if a country stops selling them sand at a certain point, they have to be able to float their construction market until they are able to start buying from somebody else. This has led to 3 massive sand dune stockpiles to pop up in the city that function basically as central reserves, right? If you want to think about it from a banking perspective. But they're also national security sites. These photos are all taken either across a reservoir. Singapore's relationship to drinking water is, again, another fascinating tangent we don't have time for. But also, there's highly surveyed places. You can see this kind of green security fence that runs around this whole perimeter. There's a guard booth there, cameras, lights, drainage to keep these kind of just piles of essentially sand and gravel as dry as possible. And so what I set out to do is try and figure out, again, because these are kind of not black sites, that's being too melodramatic, but there's very little information on how much sand is in these areas, or even anything about like when they've opened, or what their possible capacity might be. So I tried to use my own photogrammetry methods to sort of establish these heights and try to build a sort of rudimentary volumetric 3D model of these things, which generates sort of gigantic 3D models that look something like this. And so using these as a sort of document, what I was able to find is that, given my own calculations, there's actually about 6.4 million cubic meters of sand being held at Tampines stockpile, which is this one. There's about 3.58 million at Algol, which is the one up in the center, smallest. And there's about 7.78 million cubic meters of sand at Seletar, which is this one. So just to give you some context, if you were to take all of the sand in the Tampines stockpile and spread it in a single layer, it would cover Central Park. So these are just massive quantities of material that are basically just there, secured and treated as, like, again, a national security project, just kind of left to be documented. Now, obviously, that's mostly sand for concrete to be poured and mixed with cement and water. Singapore is also expanding its coastline. This is a photo I, again, took over a barbed wire fence looking at a polder. A polder is a Dutch way of reclaiming land. You build a dike, so there's a little lake that forms, which is what you're looking at in the foreground here. You then dredge that water out and backfill earth into what used to be the ocean floor, basically, and compact it, and you've got new territory. But again, these are sort of based, observing this is based on your ability to be there in person with a camera and know what to look for, know where to go. Likewise, you can see, these sort of like tanker ships offloading sand. If you, again, know which ports around Singapore accept these deliveries, kind of know how to use ship tracking software. And so what I was trying to do to get a sense of like how these, where is the shipping fleet basically? Like, right, how does this stuff actually get from either a nation very far away as Vietnam, or a sort of like ocean bed where Singapore is allowed to dredge sand off the ocean floor. And what I was able to find, again, just using sort of ship tracking data, official news stories, is that there's actually what they call sand borrow areas off the coast of Malaysia. So Singapore is right here. Malaysia's up here. There's one area over here, another area over there, where there was just a huge majority of the dredgers that are active in the area moving around. It's worth noting that at one point when Singapore was really revving up its land expansion activities, about 80% of all the dredgers in the world were in the Singapore Strait just to supply the demand needed. As of February last year, this is the sort of extent of the current fleet. And what's interesting is actually there is still a very heavy presence of international private companies that do this work. So a lot of these dredgers, actually all of them basically except two, are flagged to other countries. A lot of Belgium and the Netherlands actually have a lot of dredging experience. So those construction companies are here, Chinese construction companies. So it really, the shipping fleet, which is shown here, is really kind of a multinational endeavor, right? It's tying together all of these different nations around Singapore's specific project. But again, that's still not everything, right? That a lot of this data relies on you being there, relies on you knowing what to look for. So this last avenue is based around actually using satellite data. I'm using geospatial research as a way of tracing these changes. So there are 5 main kind of sand addition areas around Singapore. All of them have something to do with basically infrastructure, the airport, a military base, cargo terminals, petrochemical processing, et cetera, et cetera. You get the picture. And so what I did is I actually used a program called Landsat. So Landsat is an American satellite program. There have been 8 missions. A satellite orbits the Earth once every 16 days. So twice a month, you get a complete photograph of every inch of the Earth's surface in consistent tiles, which is what you can see over here, right? So it's always in the same place. If you then, again, knowing what to look for, what I did was I actually built a sort of digital drawing machine that takes these Landsat image outputs, runs them through a 3D modeling program that looks for where land has been added, and generates a sort of false topography, not so much about identifying the sort of geographical contours, because again, you can see that from a map, but trying to index this growth against where this sand likely came from. So what you wind up with are these sort of splotchy, roughly color-coded pieces of the coastline. So like, for example, if you zoom in over here, starting with, so this is the Tuas megaport. It's going to be the largest cargo terminal in the world when it's done in about 7 years. And this one has some yellow splotches, which is Vietnam, but most of it is a little blown out, but most of it is actually this kind of like teal green, which is Cambodian, versus the site next to it in the middle, which is this amazing island called the Jurong Petrochemical Facility. It basically processes all different kinds of petroleum products. That was actually built very quickly for one of these fake islands, not fake, they're very real, one of these artificial islands. And so that one you can see has, a relatively smaller range of colors included in it, right? So there's information when you string these things together, sort of a kind of a geological understanding of how Singapore's coastline has been modified and which of Singapore's neighbors have actually contributed to this project. This was then, I then had the sort of secondary challenge of trying to like condense all of this into an exhibition format for the Chicago Biennial last year. And what I decided to do was basically come up with 3 elements to do this. One is a tapestry, the second is a table, and the third is what I call a material drawing set. So this exhibition is traveling. This image is from its stop at Woodbury last spring. So the tapestry acts as this kind of table of contents, sort of taking all that stuff I just covered, putting it into a single 48-foot long strip of images and maps and diagrams. What I want to talk about here as well is trying to sort of translate this ethos of material responsibility into how the exhibition was constructed. So I was able to use a sort of chain link and rivet and zip tie system to hold this tapestry to the wall, which you can see above. And then also all of the seating in this particular version of the exhibition were offcuts from Woodbury's wood shop. So basically all of this stuff will be recycled by the students. It may have already been. I don't know when their term starts, but the idea being all of this stuff has a second life beyond, beyond this exhibition. So the table itself was the second component. It's, again, especially designed to sort of be able to hold books open and with an eye towards the composition of the material drawing set itself. So thinking about, how can you maybe like circulate around the table while reading various things that have been left open at various pages. It's hard to talk about the table without also talking about the drawing set itself, which basically takes everything that's been published about this project, both images but also text, and splits it up into a series of 12 volumes. So text only in one, certain images in another, images from a different project in a third, all keyed together. So as you are circulating the table, reading things, looking at images, you can sort of work backwards to where these things have come from. And so, again, the idea here is that when you're dealing with something as complex and as vast as this, the idea is not that there's one single way, one single toolkit to summarize all of the ways that sand impacts the way Singapore looks. And I'm sure these are not exhaustive either, so if any of you were to do the same investigation, you might wind up with a totally different format, totally different way of doing it. Again, the idea though is that this is a sort of, it was a kind of a first step away from maybe like the idea of a drawing as an object or something that had to sort of capture every single bit of information within itself and sort of starting to work these things together as a team. I'm going to switch now to a couple embodied and not just default to tearing down walls. So this project, there are only, I'm going to do this very carefully, so I'll just leave it there. There are only 2 new walls in this whole thing. There's this enclosure here, and there's this little sort of nose cone on this wall. Everything else that's shaded in blue is new, but it's like cabinetry, millwork, bathtubs, etc. This was basically, I'm just going to cover kind of like the 3 main elements and just sort of talk through them a bit in turn. So the first is this, what I call the homosote wardrobe. This is in the studio. Homosote is a sort of like a fiber, basically uses a pinup board. So this is a kind of combination closet storage and like painting storage. And the idea here was that we were sort of also triangulating between the co-op that this apartment is a part of. They had a real problem with modifying the layout. So they told us we couldn't build closets, but we could build wardrobes and build quote unquote temporary furniture. So this is all, again, theoretically demountable and could be, I suppose, moved someplace else. But again, the net effect, though, is that, again, it was sort of substituting a sort of more permanent, fixed kind of building for one that is maybe a little bit more resilient, maybe a little bit more flexible in the future, because it could be removed, and the materials in it, the homosote, plywood, these are all materials that could be reused and salvaged in the future. These are also just, again, sort of talking about the kind of like the ways that storage space could be kind of hidden, thinking about the sort of secondary life of both building systems for this apartment that we could not move. This is on the 15th floor. So there's 14 other stories and 6 stories on top of this one that all have to share steam pipes, gas lines, water lines. So in some cases, like this blue tower here, we just had to sort of like deal with steam risers that came through the floor in almost every single room, trying to sort of build an enclosure that wouldn't warp or get the heat that these things put out. And on the other side, dealing with, again, because we weren't able to move, or I was unwilling to move the walls, we wound up with this very long hallway, which we then repurposed as a gallery, but also using the sort of like entry area in this homosote wardrobe as a sort of secondary storage space. So trying to be as strategic as possible and as flexible as possible. This led to the development of what I like to call sort of like loose fit details. So the original walls of this building are plaster. They're not straight, the ceiling's not straight, everything is crooked. And so what we had to do was basically do our best to sort of be very specific about some things, right? So this, I'll talk about why this opening is here in a minute, but you can see we've added some kind of lowered areas of the ceiling to run power. We use a lot of reveals at the sort of top here and over here. There's another steam pipe behind this, but as you can see, we're so close to the window that we had to sort of angle the wall in order to get it just enough in front of the steam pipe, but not in front of the glass of the window so that the clients didn't lose any view. And so the idea here is that, you sort of learn to work, if you go this route of leaving things as they are, it also makes the sort of architecture that you create in response a sort of dialogue and a sort of like, in my opinion, very rewarding set of compromises between what you want to do in a sort of like totally, we're in a world where everything is possible versus what is achievable given the space. So I mentioned that gap in the back of the wall. So this is an element we call the big wall. It actually is a chase wall. So within this area here, all of the gas lines and water lines for all the kitchens are running, so we couldn't modify this. We could only carve away over here because the intercom for the building actually runs over here. So we had to find a little area higher than a countertop, but wide enough to be useful for getting some daylight back to the main entry to the apartment. And then on the front, because we had added a dishwasher, we actually had to make this, again, I mentioned in the first slide, the sort of nose cone, which is this chamfered piece of new construction that makes this sort of very crisp edge and hides the depth of all of those pipes that are running right behind this. So, this is, again, just sort of like the family portrait of all of these things taken together. And again, just the lesson for me with this was that, how much can actually be achieved through a very, very specific set of very small interventions and without blowing up the floor plan. So it took a lot of kind of studying the space, learning what I liked about it, articulating what I liked about it to the clients and myself. And in the end, I think sort of creating this space that they tell me feels completely different, even though 99% of the layout is exactly the same as it was before we started. I'm going to move quickly through a second project, which is on the books right now. It's called The House with Two Stairs. Working title, sorry. So this project has its beginnings. This is a project in Leadville, Colorado, which is a small town up in the mountains just outside of Denver. It's in a historic district, which meant that when the clients purchased this Victorian house that is, if you can tell, leaning over on its neighbor, they couldn't just demolish it. So I was brought in to try and help them sort of figure out what they could save and salvage versus what had to be sort of torn down and put back in front of the Leadville Historic Preservation Committee. So as I said, this is a very old house. It dates to at least 1883, although the town hall in Leadville burned down sometime around then, so we don't actually know. This is from the report we had commissioned about, what had been done to this house over the years. So the red is the sort of original core, and then everything else around it has been added on, but unfortunately not maintained, and even more importantly, not sitting on a foundation. So everything is subsiding. All of these additions are actually in the process of breaking off from this main red volume. And so our proposal was basically to allow that breaking process to happen and retain as much of the core of the original house while replicating all of the sort of relatively modern things that exist in the additions, like the kitchen and the bathroom, in a historically compliant but more efficient layout. So this is where the sort of two stairs in the name of the project comes from. So we wound up basically creating a secondary stair core, which is what you see over there on the left. Which kind of organizes and orients the new portions of the house. And then in the right-hand side, you see the original stair from the sort of Victorian core, which has been kind of reworked. And so, again, talking about like a sort of similar set of issues around like, how do you sort of preserve something? The historic committee really only has jurisdiction on the outside of this building, but that has implications for what they would and would not allow as far as like the massing of this kind of stepping addition that wraps around the back. We also had to deal with, again, leaving this historic core intact. So this is the second floor plan. In green is what's original. And so we came up with this system of kind of removing the cladding. It's just wood clapboard, removing that from areas that now get captured by this kind of like new double height addition. So taking cladding material from here, using it to repair in a historically acceptable manner all of the sides of the original building that are visible from the street. And then in its place, inserting a sort of polycarbonate like new skin that allows this what used to be a very dark bedroom on the second floor to become this kind of like open sort of airy space that is between the living room below, the master bedroom, and this kind of reworked stair. These are just, again, some sections showing kind of like from front to back how the new and the old sort of like relate to each other. There was a point where we had to, you can see it here, introduce a very bright, very obvious bit of structural reinforcing to make up for all the stuff we had taken away. And so again, it's a similar process, but I think what I hope this kind of demonstrates, right, is this ethos of, preservation above all else does not have to mean that it looks like a house with a bunch of additions added onto it. I think part of the creativity of being in a position to do these interventions is that you get to sort of have this, you have a choice about how much you want things to either align with what's there, or you actually have a surprising amount of latitude to make things new and appear more contemporary if that's what you want. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Great Lakes Architectural Expedition. Actually, I was going back and forth about including this, but given that this is the School of Public Architecture, I thought this would be fitting. So this is a project that is kind of mostly at this point exhibition-based. There were 2 showings of this, one at Ohio State, and the other at Kent. And the show focuses on the titular Great Lakes Architectural Expedition, which is a made-up public architecture office that I designed along with its projects in this show. So the idea here is that these exhibitions are sort of future retrospectives of how this office works and the sort of projects it does as a public architecture office. So why the Great Lakes? I'm going to gloss over this very quickly. It's a little bureaucratic, but what you need to know is that the water in the Great Lakes are governed by a law called the Great Lakes Compact, which basically says you can't take water out of the Great Lakes for private purposes. So you can drink it, but you can't necessarily put it in a tanker ship and send it to China. You have to sort of keep it all within the watershed. So the immediate impact of this law was that the watershed boundary, which is this geographically defined feature, right? It's just the high point where rainfall goes one way on one side and the other way on the other. That line does not align to where cities have been built, county lines have been drawn, et cetera, et cetera. So the So the initial response was to say, okay, so there's this new third kind of thing where you are geographically outside the watershed but can still partake in the water of the Great Lakes. So it actually, basically what has happened is this geographical line is actually now this political line, if that makes sense. So all well and good, except you may have heard during the 2016 election in Wisconsin, they announced this landmark deal to build a LCD screen manufacturing plant in Wisconsin. The problem was they chose a site that was exactly half in and half out of the watershed. So this is actually just south of that previous slide. This is a town called Basin in kind of southeastern Wisconsin. So Chicago's down there, Milwaukee's up there. This is the Foxconn site, and this is the watershed line that splits it exactly in half. So what was interesting to me about this is that Foxconn's lawyers obviously knew that this compact was a law, and all they realized was that there wasn't any hard and fast specific definition in that law about what constituted a public use versus a private use, other than just rough examples. So all they said is that this is in fact public, even though it's a factory owned by a private company. And due to political pressure, that was enough. So the last event that sort of formed my thinking here is the city of Toledo, which is a city in Ohio, not Spain, right over here, declared Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes, to be legally a person in 2018. And basically this was to allow the residents of the city, which relies on the lake for drinking water, to sue polluters on behalf of the lake for causing harmful algal blooms, which basically render the city's water undrinkable for weeks at a time in the summer. This law was eventually struck down, but it got me thinking, what would it mean to have Lake Erie, if it was a person, as a client? Like, how might that sort of change the way that you think about building, change the way you see this region? These are the 5 Great Lakes, and they're both they're geographic, but also they're sort of added watersheds. Starting to think about it kind of like an actual border, a border that you can't really perceive because it's not a state boundary yet. It's not necessarily a visible boundary. These differences in geography can be, imperceptible to the human eye. And so, is this complete? Yes, okay. So the exhibitions at Knowlton School of Architecture, which is at Ohio State, and also at Kent State Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, start to look at a series of projects. This is a video just showing the various ways that water can be removed out of the Great Lakes at present. There are a few obvious exceptions. Obviously, there's exceptions to this law, and this is just a video kind of documenting what those exceptions are. So the idea was that these exhibitions are going to look at that as sort of a historical document, but also sort of forward-facing in a way. Oops. Okay, right. So going through the exhibition itself. So there's 3 key projects. Number 1, the Parliament for a Material World, the Maumee Basin Phosphorus Co-op, and the Last Impervious Surface in Portage County, Ohio. So starting with the Parliament for a Material World, this was my attempt to sort of think about, well, okay, so this is this public architecture office. What does their actual office look like? What I came up with is a sort of large, largely open grid of public space on the banks of the Maumee River, which runs through downtown Toledo and feeds Lake Erie. And the idea here is that, again, if this is a public agency with a public client, maximum exposure to the public is really key. So the idea here is that it's all about meeting and negotiation, right? So there are all of these sort of like conference rooms. The actual architecture office itself is this really small little room over here with a couple of desks for, you know, all of the Rhino and CAD you could ever want. But the real bulk of it is this large sort of meeting room in the center, which is where you would have the kind of representative body of Lake Erie, which acts as the client. So this is actually not a fabrication. In the Netherlands and in some counties in Minnesota, they actually do this where they elect individuals that you or I can negotiate with to advocate on behalf of a water body. So in the Netherlands, it's the entire country. In Minnesota, counties opt in. But again, the point being, it gives you an actual person who is, again, supposed to act in the interests of these, sort of inanimate objects. And so you have the client cohabitating with the architects who are further both cohabitating within this kind of public realm, right? So the idea, which is expressed to this sort of abstract model, is that there's a sort of cascading process of negotiation, review, and that the products of this sort of negotiation process might be considered of architectural value, right? Like we'll explore this in the sort of next few projects, but again, trying to get away from the idea that like a building as a product is necessarily the only or best outcome of architectural practice. So manipulation of the scale of models is going to be a sort of recurring theme throughout these. So as I said, this one, the furniture is all to scale, but it's been sort of condensed and stacked in a way to sort of show a kind of sequence of how a project might move through this agency and into the real world. So to illustrate that, let's talk about the second project, which is the Maumee Basin Phosphorus Co-op. I mentioned harmful algal blooms. A lot of those are generated because the area around Toledo in northwest Ohio is largely agricultural. It's very fertile. But what that means is when there's a rainfall event or a big storm, a lot of that fertilizer gets pushed into the water systems, which eventually wind up in Lake Erie. It's there that algae find these fertilizers and feed on them. The algae are toxic, so you can't drink the water with the algae in it. You have to wait until it subsides. So this would be, again, a product. This model is meant to be a sort of product of this agency, right, which is not a topography in the sort of geographical sense, but it's actually a pollution topography with Toledo up here marked in the center. And the idea being, again, this would be something that anybody really could produce, but sort of both a sort of public resource, right? Like, where does the pollution come from? And also an object that kind of stands alone as a sort of like information display. Zooming into what the co-op actually is, this is using a technology that exists called an Algol turf scrubber. Basically, you bring the algae to the pollution source and you hang them from these big plastic sheets and you run polluted water over them. The algae eats the fertilizer out of the water as it passes down these kind of curtains, and then the clean water can be released and go on its way. This is actually, if you guys have aquariums or fish tanks, these are actually commercially available for doing this exact same thing in a fish tank. So there's a series of these kind of nodes that dot the waterways of these agricultural areas. There are these clusters of these towers, which actually look something more like this. And again, these have been stretched to make them visible. They're actually quite small. And the idea being, again, that this is a co-op, right? So the farmers, the people who need the fertilizer for their crops would actually be able to benefit because algae can also be used as a carbon sink. So you're fixing carbon while also eating pollutants out of the water stream. So kind of like trying to bridge the infrastructure and public scale through these shared resources. It's just a detail of one of those towers with so the turf scrubbers are these kind of mesh screens. All right, so the last one I want to talk about is called The Last Impervious Surface in Portage County, Ohio. It's the longest title I've ever come up with so far. That was a joke. Okay. So the idea here is this is actually kind of like a backwards-looking project about a sort of taking the logic of the Great Lakes Compound and extending it, right, and trying to see how maybe this forms a kind of like negative or maybe a cynical reading of this same project and how an activist public architecture office might come back in and actually intervene for the public good. So this spillway, the idea here is that the spillway exists cutting through Portage County, which is this red county right here. This is Cleveland and Akron. And as you can see, it's being split by the Lake Erie watershed. And a lot has been written about how the Great Lakes Compact was not written to protect the environment, but actually to encourage companies like Foxconn to actually come back to the Great Lakes. So in a way, that whole thing I was mentioning about Foxconn saying they're public and being private actually might have been this law working as intended. And so if you follow that logic, it stands to reason that the residents of this county might try to actually modify the extents of this territory on their own. So, all you have to do, quote unquote, all you have to do is make a 500-foot wide, 5-foot tall asphalt wedge that goes into the Ohio River watershed. So the Ohio River flows away from the Great Lakes. And all that's going to do is redirect rainfall back towards Lake Erie, and it would be enough to basically feed 100,000 people a year. So the idea is this is a very selfish infrastructure, megastructure, however you want to call it. And so what I was trying to explore here is kind of how this office maybe acts as sort of like a kind of a FEMA agency. So these are a series of kind of large-scale isometric drawings that are looking at the new flow patterns around this megastructure, because again, it's all based on rainfall, what you could do on the surface of this kind of landform. And the sort of last impervious surface part of it would be removing asphalt with these red fills, removing the asphalt from the roads on the sort of inside of this infrastructure, which is now taking on all of this extra rainfall, so to try to keep people's houses from being swept away. This was also manifested. This is a sort of, again, stretched model that could be used to kind of study these flow patterns. So this is a 1 to 500 scale chunk of the spillway itself, but also scaled vertically by a factor of 30. So again, just to be able to see these sort of changes up close. And again, what I'd like to sort of throw out here about this is that it's a sort of moving away from a kind of like client-oriented structure here, like an individual client, and moving towards maybe advocacy and the public good also means that architecture's relationship to truth and sort of like physical truth starts to change, where if you're making a model that's making an argument, like say where the water is going to go, you start to maybe develop a looser relationship to like geographical specificity. So this thing is scaled, sheared, but made to do that in search of like a broader point, right? So this is my last slide. I'm just going to say that, again, so just returning to this idea of like post-concreteness, obviously I'm not the first person to, pursue non-demolishing renovations or collaborate with, diverse teams of professionals or, kind of daydreamed about alternative modes of practice. really, I try to put these out here as an attempt to maybe explore that, these blurring of boundaries might start to become even more normal, right? Maybe think about how architects might not just have to focus on buildings, but also be advocates both for their clients, for a better world, for themselves, and maybe also the materials that we do actually use on site. So I think that's where I'll end it, but thank you. Hopefully it wasn't too loud.
That was good.
All right, great.
Questions?
What materials have you been exploring with a new type, maybe a new type of concrete or maybe because there's no.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I didn't have time to include it today, but I've been working on a project that will likely be demolished soon. It's for a sort of older, an older client that will likely sell the house, but they need certain things done. And so what I've been trying to do is not necessarily like a new form of concrete, but I actually was trying to think up a way to make a wall out of common enough materials that it wouldn't be like super bespoke or expensive, but doing, a lot of due diligence and a lot of like honest conversations with the client about finding things that would biodegrade naturally in a landfill or could be reused. So we came up with this Cork and OSB wall system, basically, where the OSB can be kind of like used again, sensitively kind of like taken care of, and the cork is actually biodegradable. So either it can be reused, or if it goes to the landfill, it's not ideal, but it's not going to stay there forever, like drywall or concrete or something like that. So I would say it's because my practice has sort of started to shift towards like building and sort of being a service as opposed to just research. It's a really it's a really tricky thing, actually, to like sort of, because you can't rely on like a new material necessarily. You have to sort of consider what somebody actually wants and how they're going to react if you say, well, we'll just rethink concrete, right? That's not always the case. But,
yeah, thanks for coming for a really provocative lecture. Some beautiful, really beautiful images. Two comments. First, the house with two stairs. And some really extraordinary drawings. The worm's eye act.
Thank you.
And it made me think, there was a period in the 20th century when all the experimentations about what architecture could be were the scale of the house. Right? Basically, the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was so much about the house as a device to begin those kinds of explorations. And it was great to kind of come back to that, because I think we found something in that scale that allowed you to get at that and explore it. And it was great to see images that weren't renders.
Yeah.
I have to say, sort of, put yourself in the context of the drawing that represents the actual building was wonderful. Second comment has to do with water. It's really fascinating with water. And as a child of the Great Lakes, I grew up in one of the Great Lakes. I have a particular real fondness for what you're trying to do there, and really appreciate it. It also made me think of the Netherlands. And as you point out, the whole 40% of the country would be underwater if they didn't manage the water system and the protection from the water from the OC. So everybody is invested in it. It affects everything about the social structure, the political structure, every part of it. And yet there's still places for experimentation. So what came to mind was Weideveld's work in the 20s and the 30s. Do you know this work at all?
Not specifically, no.
It was a kind of visionary attempt to imagine what water could be in addition to what it was in the Netherlands at the time. And I would encourage you to take a look at that.
For sure.
He did a big exhibition maybe 15 years ago about his work, and one of the best installations of architecture I've ever seen.
Oh, cool.
That he's seen. I guess the question I would have for you is this: when you get into what you're dealing with, which is at a scale that goes way beyond what we think about for architecture, first, I'm really appreciative of you willing to address issues at that scale. Can you do it alone, or are there fellow travelers you have to, or you want to bring into this effort to take you and educate you about it?
The folks on YouTube would like you to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry.
Just wanted.
Yeah. So the question was basically, just to paraphrase, who else do you have to engage really to work at the scale of like, a planetary system? And it's a really good question. I would say that I think this kind of takes place in a realm of, be careful not to overgeneralize, but this is, I think, a sort of emerging way of looking at the world in architecture, maybe academia. Like a lot of the younger practitioners, I think, have started to maybe move away from the visionary single project at a similar scale to what I'm talking about, but are now sort of like thinking about things maybe on a bit more of a pragmatic scale, right? So architecture as a component in a team of sort of like multidisciplinary actors. And so, I guess for the Great Lakes one, I mean, I think what stuck out to me is that doing this work and sort of like getting as involved as I was able to get, it was the most rewarding parts of it to me were actually working with like, the people. I barely talked to architects at all, actually. It was a lot of like, obviously like landscape architects, but specifically landscape architects that deal with the sort of infrastructural scale of agriculture. When this was shown at the Kent campus in downtown Cleveland, I was talking a lot with the folks there who are, again, on the sort of landscape side of things, but also dealing specifically with like community. And so, so that's the kind of research side of things, like those kind of partnerships. I think if you're thinking about also like what it would mean moving forward, like if any of this was actually implemented, I don't know if that's part of the question or.
It could be.
Yeah, because I think on that level, what did strike me about the Great Lakes in particular and water in general is I think it is one of these issues where it is highly constructed and it is highly regimented and it is highly like it's a very known hyperobject, right? Like there's a lot of data about it and there's a lot of interest about it. And in the Great Lakes, what I thought has been so fascinating, at least, I guess we'll see how things go in the future, but it really is this thing that sort of cuts across a lot of different interest groups, like taking care of the Great Lakes, maintaining it as a sort of natural resource. And so, I could see this project really tapping into a lot of sort of like the scientific side of things, like what is actually needed, because a lot of it is in architecture. I think a lot of it is just putting architecture in a position to be helpful. By that, I mean like maybe, again, I think of like the, where did it go? The big blue model of pollution, right? Like something like this where, you don't have to, again, as I was saying, like you don't have to design a building to make a point, but you can make things spatial, you can make things tangible. And like the idea of, architecture as a kind of like go-between maybe between like the general public and experts, I think is something that really resonates and still does. I mean, it resonates a lot to me today of like how the actual craft of what we do, like the drawings and the models, it's both a sort of like, it's kind of a competition within the field, right? You want to make stuff that looks nice and do things in a sort of interesting way. But to me, I think that's the really, when you want to talk about like what an architect is paid to do, I think this sort of active translation and sort of like translation and the sort of idea of like fidelity to like, there's a benefit here that is universal, but it's also an argument because you have a formal or sort of like, you have an opinion on what is needed, right? So I think, I don't know, I hope this makes sense, but there's something in that kind of triangulation which I find really, really like gratifying when it works. And
I would put it this way: in the Netherlands, water is an existential question.
Right.
Everybody's invested in it because 2,000 people died in 1953 with the Basin, right? And everyone has a role to play in the shared governance system. The conventions of the water managers are huge, everyone knows about it. in this country it's invisible.
Right.
And I think what's great about what you've done is start to show what can be visible, and so that we can start to imagine who is involved with this.
Right.
The same way that the Dutch. I mean, I think that the construction environment in the Netherlands, I think, is extraordinary at every level.
Right.
And that's not the case here. And I think that's maybe the one real virtue I see in what you're doing, is starting to expose that as a way, and looking for where the intervention can come. So again, it'd be interesting to hear, and I would imagine the next steps are, who are those fellow travelers that you want to?
Yeah. No, and it makes me think as well. I mean, obviously it's been in the news, but the whole thing with it's not the Rio Grande, the Colorado River in the Southwest, and how, again, it's like these are invisible boundaries until there's a crisis or until somebody proactively makes them visible, right? So the idea of like how that water system gets managed across 4 or 5 U.S. states plus an entirely different federal entity in Mexico, like, thinking about how do you sort of get ahead of the crisis, right, so that people don't have to die, I mean, again, to me that seems like it's a sort of like immediate entry point for people who are trained like we are, who can draw things and think about scenarios and think forward. But I think also, I mean, to the fellow travelers part, I think it also makes us valuable as interpreters or advocates. Yeah.
So Richard has a follow-up question on that he posted on YouTube. It seems that you might come up against big money/corporate interests that wouldn't want you discovering things about their operation. Did you encounter problems? If so, how did you overcome them?
That is a fantastic question. So what I realized shortly after arriving in Singapore is that in the 4 months leading up to my arrival there, the government's shame is not the right word, but they started to feel bad, or they felt that there was a big expose in the New York Times about a few of these sites that I visited and how Singapore had been constructing them and building them. And I guess there was a fine line between what the government considered flattering about an article like that. Like, I had heard from people that the Prime Minister had it framed in his office, versus a lot of the work, again, speaking of fellow travelers, that a lot of the sort of like environmental justice advocates that I worked with, who are doing stuff around Cambodian sand mining operations and the sort of sand mafias that sprung up over there, they were also running counter exposés about the ways that this was basically all Singapore's fault. Like, nobody else was buying sand from Cambodia like this. It was really just them. And so what I realized when I arrived is actually that a lot of the people I've been hoping to talk with would not talk with me. And it wasn't just the government. It was also, again, because Singapore is it is one of the most master planned places on Earth. It's super fascinating on its own kind of social level, but so basically the architects that I've been hoping to speak with just about their practice and about using concrete and about whether they had considered alternatives, I had told them the truth that I was dealing with sand, and they decided not to talk to me either. Or if I did get a meeting with them, I couldn't actually ask them directly. I had to ask them other things about building with concrete, working with contractors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it definitely helped push me into the sort of like forensic mode of that project. Probably, I think, in a good way. I mean, I had more fun doing it this way, and I hope it was more interesting. But yeah, I mean, it's from like that sort of like research perspective for sure. It was. I don't think I'm on a list. I don't think they care about me specifically, but it certainly made my life difficult. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's enough on that one.
I think we're at time. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, guys.